Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring remote viewing and nautical archaeology. We'll be looking in particular at the recovery of the wreckage of a 19th century American brig known as the Leander. My guest is Stephan Schwartz, who is the author of The Secret Vaults of Time, Psychic Archaeology and the Quest for Man's Beginnings. His other books include The Alexandria Project, Opening to the Infinite, The 8 Laws of Change, How to Be an Agent of Personal and Social Transformation, as well as novels, The Vision, a novel of time and consciousness, and Awakening, a novel of aliens and consciousness, and to be published shortly, The Amish Girl, a novel of psychic criminology and consciousness based on a real case study. Once again, this is an internet interview. I hope you'll find it of higher quality than previous ones. I'm really working hard to increase the technical quality of interviews on the internet, and now I'll switch over to that video. Welcome, Stephan. It's a pleasure to be with you once again. And once again, we're going to talk about some of what I regard as very important work that you've been doing in the field of nautical archaeology. We did an earlier interview about the exploration you did off the coast of Jamaica, looking for one of the original caravel ships of Christopher Columbus. Now we're going to look at a project that took place in the Bahamas.
Yes.
And
welcome. Glad to talk to you again.
Yeah, it's great to be with you, Stephan. This is a project I understand that you did in coordination with the Bahamian government. They actually gave you exclusive permission to begin an archaeological excavation or search in a particular, very clearly defined area.
Yes. Well, I actually had to get the Bahamian government to change the law in order to do it. But they gave us the permission to do a survey of the Grand Bahama Banks, which had not been previously done. So we had the Bahamian government involved, and then we had Nova University involved, and Peter Throckmorton, who is one of the founders of marine archaeology, was the lead archaeologist working for us on that. So we had Nova University, and then we had graduate students from several other universities who came out and participated in this survey of the Grand Bahama Banks. And we also had researchers in the major nautical archives in the United States, England, and in Spain, also searching to see if there was any prior evidence of any of the ships that we found. This particular project that we're going to talk about is an American brig. We were able to identify it at the end as the Leander. And the Leander was an American brig that apparently, based on Throckmorton's analysis, was caught in a storm. It's the hurricanes down there, and went into the lee of this little. It's not really even hardly an island. It's more like a ridge, but it allowed them to get in the lee of the worst of the wind and storm. And then something happened, and they apparently sank. We don't know why.
And so, working with remote viewers, you were able to identify the location and actually recover some objects.
Yes, we did a survey, that, as we've discussed before, we did a survey of the entire search area, which was 579 square miles. And we located a number of ships. This was just the most important one in that particular area. And of course, as usual, I ran a parallel operation with independent specialists who did an electronic survey of the same area and to see whether you could locate, using traditional electronic remote sensing, the same site that the remote viewers were able to locate. And as was the case in this instance, and in all prior cases as well, by the way, and subsequent, you were not able to locate it using electronic remote sensing. Only remote viewing made the location possible.
In reading your paper, I was left with the impression that the area that you searched, I think you identify it as something like Search Area C, the 569 square mile area, which is pretty large. That is actually a subsection of the Grand Bahama Banks.
Well, Search Area C was an area of 11.81 square miles out of an area of 500, almost 579 square miles. Now, you have to think of this, Jeff. You can't go very far in. It gets very shallow. The Grand Bahama Banks is limestone. Basically, if you saw it on the land, you'd think of it as a kind of a massif or a cliff. The depth of the water goes from anywhere from 13 to 25 feet down to about between 1,200 and 1,700 feet. So if you were looking at it, if you were driving in a car and you were looking at this, it would be like this enormous massif that and that you'd be looking up at if you were in the car and you were down at the depth of it. And of course, the Gulf Stream runs up this channel next to this cliff. And so you have this large world ocean stream of ocean current, and then it hits this kind of wall, which then becomes quite shallow. And so the search area that we're looking at is long, but not very wide, because it gets down to 10, 9, 8, 7 feet. So ships can't get in there. So that we weren't searching that. What we were searching was the area where a ship could still operate. Now, it is true that in some cases, ships would hit this area and would hit a shallow spot, and the top of the ship would break off. It had to do with the way wooden ships were manufactured, and the top would keep going further not inland, but further into this zone. But we were searching this long, relatively narrow, just a couple of miles, few miles. So it's quite extensive. And then, in accordance, just as we described in our discussion on the Caravel project, I ask a series of viewers I give them a map that has all the colors and the names taken off. And I ask them to locate, in this case, the task was, please locate any shipwrecks that you see in this area. And I had researchers in Spain and in Maine and in England who were searching nautical archives to see if we could identify some of the ships that they located. Why we were able to identify them. But because we were testing the ability of remote viewing, we were particularly interested in ships that the remote viewers located that were not previously known to exist. I mean, the ships were known to exist, but what happened to them was not known, and their location was unknown. So there's a large number of ships that run into the Bahama Banks and bad things happen to them. In this case, this particular wreck, this Brig Leander, was a known ship. Obviously, that's how we know its name. But what happened to it had never been known. So it was simply listed as a missing ship, as was quite common in the days of sail, where ships would just go down for one reason or another, and nobody ever knew what happened.
Now, as I recall from your paper, the historical researchers uncovered records of some 300 ships that had sunk in that general area.
Yeah, that's correct. In the general search area, the whole search area we had, there was about 300 ships that we were able to identify. This was part of the survey. We published, Peter Throckmorton and I published a survey of the Grand Bahama Banks listing all of these ships. It was the first time it had ever been done. And then from the remote viewing point of view, we were particularly interested in the location of wrecks that were unknown and could not be identified and as to their location, but for which we could get historical documentation as to what kind of ship they were, and so that we had documented information with which to compare the remote viewing to do the concept by concept analysis. And so the Brig Leander, we were able to to get a description of the ship, not what happened to it, but there were records of it it was an American brig, and it came out of the northeastern United States. So we had some comparative material that we could look at. The interesting thing, as I said, is that we do a parallel survey of the whole thing using, in this case, side-scan sonar and proton precession magnetometers. And you would not have been able to locate this Brig Leander using electronic remote sensing. And also, when we went to the place where the remote viewers led us, there was nothing to see. The ship was, as described by the viewers, was between 3 and 4 feet under the sand. So even if you had been diving, and that's not impossible that people had been diving in that area, there was nothing to see, so you never would have found it. So the point, from the point of view of remote viewing, was that there was no other way to find this ship but remote viewing.
And I gather that this ship was located in what you've identified as Search Area C.
Yes. So the way the process works is I give them a map that's just black and white, or that I run through a blueprint maker. And because we know from research that people get drawn to particular colors for a variety of reasons, so you just eliminate the colors. And what we're looking for is a target area where more than one remote viewer selects that site. That produces what we call a consensus zone. And the Brig Leander, in fact, was in a consensus zone that was 11.81 square miles, 30.59 square kilometers. Because a map would have to be as big as the actual area. So when someone makes a little circle, even though they make as small and tight a circle as they can, why, in terms of the actual geographical area, it still covers a large area, in this case, just under 12 square miles. And then the next step is to take people out in a boat and give them a buoy, as I did with Hella Hammett and Alan Vaughan. And you give them a buoy one at a time, and you take them out and you say, now we're on the edge of the consensus zone that you have previously selected. So would you please direct us now to exactly the location where the ship is to be found? And when they get over that place, well, then they drop their buoy and we take a GPS fix so that we can get back. It's hard to get back to the ocean in places in the ocean. We pull the buoy up so that there's nothing to reveal where the first buoy was dropped. We go back. We let the first viewer off. We put the next viewer on. We do the same thing. We take them out to the edge of the consensus zone. We say, this is the edge of the consensus zone. Would you please locate the exact location? And you give them a buoy, and then we go out. They direct us, go left, go right. And when they get to where they think the buoy is, or where they think the location is, they drop their buoy. And we take a second GPS fix. And in this case, which is not unusual, the two locations were within about, 10 feet of each other. So you then, we did a survey, electronic survey, nothing turned up. So then we went over to be right over the ship, and we began an excavation process where we remove from the edge of the ship, so that we don't go directly down into it at first. We remove the sand until we get down to see if there are any ship remains. And in fact, of course, there were.
Well, did you pay any attention to the mental process of your remote viewers while they're in the ship with you, trying to tell you how they know that you're right on top of the target that you want to identify?
Well, there isn't a single answer to that, Jeff. Hella Hammett, for instance, felt when she was doing the map work, she looked for places there where she felt warmth. Alan Vaughan used a pendulum and did a kind of dowsing. In fact, the initial stage of the map work is a form of dowsing.
Yeah.
And Alan would he had a little pendulum that he liked, and he would take the pendulum out and do it. There were a number of viewers that took part in this. Michael Crichton, for instance, the film director and writer, the late Michael Crichton. Michael was he was a very good remote viewer, and he felt a kind of heaviness. So different people report different things, and then when you put them in the boat and you take them out, again, they have their own idiosyncratic, I guess would be the right word, their own sort of idiosyncratic physical sensations about what it is. Hella just felt she was just being pulled to it. And Alan felt similarly, that he directed us to go up to it, and he just felt a kind of weightiness. And so when he dropped it, then he dropped his buoy. So the physiological, the sensorial sensations, I guess, differ from person to person, but each of them has trained themselves to be sensitive to these usually relatively nuanced impressions, and to respond to them. The key to it, of course, is you and I have discussed before, is the ability to attain and sustain intention-focused awareness. I mean, that's the key to the whole thing. It takes many different forms. People respond differently. In the early days of parapsychology, they used to talk about clairaudience and clairvoyance, and some people would hear things, some people would feel things, some people would see things. It's as if they were different phenomena, but it's not. It's just that individual organisms respond to things with different sensitivities. Maybe that's the way to say it. Some people smell more acutely than other people. Some people have a finer sense of hearing than other people. So I never could identify anything that you could generalize. It was just about that specific person.
So there you are in the middle of the sea, and you've taken two remote viewers out independently of each other to drop a buoy, and somehow they manage to come within 10 feet of each other. That alone is quite remarkable.
Oh, I have witnessed this now for 50 years. I've been watching people do things like this. George locating the buried building in the city of the buried city of Maria. Andre Viacore in the Caravel Project, Talking Idol Evictual Project. It's astonishing to watch this happen, because it really, first of all, this is important actually. First of all, as it's happening, it seems very normal. There's nothing, it's not supernatural, it's not woo-woo. No seraphim appear. There's nothing macabre about it or occult about it. It's like going out. If you and I went out and you said to me, Stephen, do you hear that dog barking over there? It's just as casual as that. They don't make a big fuss about it. They're not in trance states. No one's speaking through them. It's none of the stuff that you see in the movies or in television shows about things like that. It's not spirits and all of that sort of stuff. It's at the time that it is happening, it seems very ordinary. It's only when you actually dig up the stuff or you dive on the stuff, whatever, and you find these extremely detailed descriptions that they've given you are in fact absolutely correct, that it's just kind of mind-boggling. In the case of Maria, the buried city, the buried building in the buried city in Egypt, Hella and George located these little tiles that were 5/8 of an inch across, and they described them as being red, black, and white, and having a white chalky substance on one side of them, which turned out to be the plaster under the way they set the tiles. But 5/8 of an inch, right? So you're looking at, I think it was 1,700 square miles. And out of that, you're getting down to something you could put in your pants pocket. I mean, it's just really amazing if you think about it. In this case, in the Brig Leander case, what really stood out for me, of many things, but particularly the description of these little medicine bottles. They described that in part of the ship, where the ship's doctor would have been, there was a box that was decayed and gone away, but that we would find these little tiny glass bottles about, maybe 1.5 inches long, little hand-blown bottles that still contained, they were still sealed because they had wax on the end. They were still sealed and contained medicines that would at the time when the ship was of one piece and still functioning, would have been in the doctor's medicine chest. So to listen to somebody from Los Angeles or from Rome, and one of the viewers was in Rome, or one of them was in Canada, some of them were back east in the United States, one was in Mexico. To listen to people who are looking at a blueprint-sized map of a large area that none of them had ever been to. I mean, there's nothing to go to. It's out in the middle of the ocean. Describe for you not only the location of the ship, but these little tiny things that you will find. They described, we would find these pewter, a kind of pewter cups. And in fact, we found them. And so you're listening to people describe these little tiny things and what they were used for that you're going to find. And then you go thousands of miles away to this middle of nowhere place, and you dig exactly where they tell you, and you find these tiny little objects. It's extraordinary. I mean, I've been watching it for decades now, and I have never stopped being amazed at the level of detail that you can get.
So you actually had divers go down and dig into the sand, and at a depth of some 3 to 4 feet, there are these vials.
The first thing we found, when we took the layer of sand off the top, Michael Crichton had said to us, the first thing you'll see are these big railroad tie-shaped beams of wood. And he said they look like railroad ties. They're parallel to one another, and they're kind of laid out. To him, they look like railroad ties. And so I couldn't figure out what that meant or what that was. But as we took off the top layer of the sand, got down to where this ship was located, by God, the first thing we saw were these railroad ties. They look exactly like railroad ties that you'd see on a train track. These sort of, how to describe them? Beams of wood, hand-hewn wood, lined up parallel, exactly as he saw them. And then as we went down not on top of the ship, but we moved out and went down sort of, if you can imagine the ship being a ship, then we went down sort of the side of it, because that allowed us to see the various layers, what had once been the decks of the ship. They had all collapsed, but we could then get a side profile of the ship and could see what kind of construction it had. And for the archaeologists, we had a team of archaeologists. Peter was the head of it. We had a group of archaeologists. And so, yes, the way this works is first you do the location part, and then you move in with equipment that will remove the sand. So I had 25 divers. It's a big operation. It was all being run off the Seaview, which was the research vessel that I acquired, a 110-foot research vessel that was set up to do marine archaeological research and recovery. We had we were also sent down a little remote operated vehicle to see what we could see first of all. And then we put divers in the water, and they couldn't see anything even when they got right on top of it. And then as we staked it out, the exact area that the viewers had outlined with, with stakes and yellow nylon line. And then that's what we began to excavate. And you can see it as they described it. One by one, all of these things that they had described appeared.
So the viewers were able to identify the outline of the wreckage of the ship pretty precisely. I presume you weren't able to do that with any kind of technological equipment.
That is correct. No, you would not have found this ship using any kind of an electronic or traditional remote sensing technology. And the reason I think was because the ones that rely on there being ferrous metal, there wasn't enough ferrous metal to set it off. And the side scan sonar, because of the structure of the rock and the sand, nothing showed up. And so the only thing we could use was the remote viewing guidance. That's why I considered the project important. I mean, we found a number of other ships and did work on them, and it, in the overall report that Peter Throckmorton and I did on the Grand Bahama Banks, we cite all kinds of ships, but this ship is important because it couldn't have been found any other way, and because of the extreme detailed observations that the remote viewers made, that were later validated by on-site excavation, and then subsequent to that, the concept by concept assessment of every concept. So we've discussed this before, but, you know, if I were saying, for instance, the man sitting in front of me with a brown tweed jacket, that's only one sentence, but it's man sitting in front of brown tweed jacket. So there's like 7 or 8 concepts in there. And the way this works is after you do the excavation, then you have experts of various kinds come in and evaluate every one of those concepts. And this is important because not only does it give you a level of accuracy that you don't see in any other kind of remote viewing work. There is, so far as I know anyway, there is no other body of remote viewing research that gets to this level of specificity. You know, the stuff that was done for classified reasons for the intelligence community, they never gave the kind of detailed concept by concept analysis. And the criminological work that we did, for instance, we couldn't get it either because the people that were asking us to do it, they just don't have the time or don't want to take the time, or, you know, they got so much other going on in their lives that spending the dozens or hundreds of hours of rating each concept because it requires research, they just don't like to do it. So unless you do it the way we did with the Mobius consensus protocol, where you bring in teams of people from different disciplines, different universities, and get them to do the assessment, and you pay for it, you just can't get it. So there's no other body of remote viewing work of which I am aware that has this level of detail. And the reason this detail is important is not just because of the accuracy, I mean, that's important, obviously, but also because it tells you things about how non-local consciousness works. This is how I got, it was doing this kind of work that led me to understand about numinosity and entropy, which we've discussed. You know, the idea that things which have been the focus of intention-focused awareness, particularly in a heightened emotional sense, that things that are easier to see for remote viewers than things which don't get much observation, or if they do get observed, nobody pays much attention. So when you work at this level of detail, you're able to extract information about how the process of remote viewing works. My interest from the beginning, I've never been interested in the question of, is this stuff real? Because by the time I got into research, there was no question in my mind that it was real. There was 50 years of research. I wrote The Secret Vaults of Time to cover all the archaeological work done prior to my becoming involved. The reason I picked archaeology was because it would offer this kind of detail, it was triple blind by definition, and it offered very meticulous details, which I understood from the beginning was going to help us understand how this all worked. So my questions were not, is it real, but how does it work, and what is it telling us about the nature of our consciousness? And a project like the Brig Leander project in the Bahamas was a teaching moment, because it showed me that, first of all, that different people, different viewers, that's why one of the reasons I use multiple viewers. I started using multiple viewers because I had been an investigative reporter for newspapers at one point in my life. And the way you do investigations like that is you get multiple sources and you ask them, and not all of them will tell you the truth. Not all of them are right. Not all of them saw everything or understood what they were seeing. I mean, there's lots of variation, but when you put the whole package together, you can pretty well reconstruct what happened. And the intelligence community does the same thing. Police do the same thing. So I was looking at, if I use men viewers and women viewers, do I get different kinds of answers? If I use viewers that have graduate education as opposed to viewers who have elementary school education, do I get different things? And by doing these kinds of experiments, I was able to tease out answers to that. Just to give you an example, in another project, I had a group of viewers. They were viewing a particular person who all of the viewers said there's something mentally wrong with this guy, and he takes some kind of medication that affects his blood. But Judith Orloff, who's a psychiatrist, and Michael Crichton, who was a physician, didn't practice but was trained as a physician, both of them said, oh, this guy he has some mental disorder, and they deal with it by giving him a neuroleptic drug. Whereas George McMullen, who had an 8th grade education, was a parts manager at a Chrysler dealership in Nanaimo, Canada. He said, there's something screwy about this guy's blood, and they give him some sort of drug that smooths him out. And so you see what that taught me was that the skill sets that people have in their normal waking life carry over to their remote viewing. For instance, Hella Hamid was a fine arts photographer and did beautiful compositions. I mean, if you look at Hella's photography, what really stands out about it is her composition and how she catches a big, prominent geometric form and builds her picture around that, for instance. And just in the same way, Hella was able to describe in, for instance, the Deep Quest experiment, the big stone block, which nobody expected, or in the Maria project, she was able to describe this strange pillar that had been built subsequently. So George McMullen, in contrast, very strongly emotionally identified with what he called First Nation people, Native American people, we would say in the States. And so he was very sensitive to their rituals and beliefs in a way that Jack Houck, who was an aeronautical engineer and worked in secret work involving satellites, what he was interested in is how the electrical circuitry and was hooked up and could describe that. So it was doing these kinds of experiments that taught me that the skill sets that people develop in their normal waking lives carry over into the altered states of consciousness that are a function of remote viewing.
Now, I gather that overall, when you take all of these details provided by all of these viewers, to the extent that you were able to evaluate them, they were about 80% accurate.
Yes, we expected. The breakdown of the concept analysis showed us, this is another reason for doing this kind of meticulous assessment. We expected over many, many experiments I realized in doing an analysis and then doing a meta-analysis of all of them that between 35 and 40% of the material that was provided by remote viewers could not be evaluated. Now, that doesn't mean it was wrong. It just meant that you couldn't evaluate it, what somebody was thinking, or the clothes they were wearing that are now decayed and gone. So between 35 and 40%, you just couldn't say one way or another. You just couldn't evaluate it. Of the part that you could evaluate, of the anywhere from 30 to 40% that you could have, the 50 to 60% that you could do, we expect to see 75 to 85% of it be judged correct or partially correct, but operationally useful. That would be, to use the earlier example, if I said the man in the gray-brown jacket, that might be partially correct, but it would still be operational. And so, or if I said the man with the green disc in his lapel, well, your disc has got more than green in it. So that would be, because we get down to that level of fineness, that would be considered partially correct, but operational, because there is in fact a metallic disc with the green color in your lapel, right? So we expect. So go ahead.
Doesn't it make sense then that with regard to the 30 to 40% of information that you cannot evaluate, that you might nevertheless assign a probability that maybe it's 80% accurate, even if you don't know for sure?
Well, yes. I mean, you could extrapolate and say, if it's 75 to 85% correct, or partially correct but operational, that the same is probably true of the unevaluatable source. But I am extremely conservative in these assessments, and so while I think you could probably say that, and it would probably be accurate, I can't say it because I can't evaluate it.
But I should imagine you must have been curious, for example, as to how this ship went down, and that probably your remote viewers gave you some indications.
They did. And not only did they give it to us, but it was validated by the archaeologists. They described this ship as getting behind this, getting on the lee side of this limestone outcropping, in order to get out of a storm, and that something had happened that I couldn't evaluate it. But when I talked to when I asked Peter and the other archaeologists, does this description of what happened sound plausible? They said yes. We know, for instance, that it didn't explode, because the parts were still all together. They were decayed, but they were together. Whereas, as for instance, as Throckmorton said, if this had been a ship in which the powder hold, for instance, for the cannon had blown up, then you would have seen a very different distribution of debris than you see in this case. If the ship had burnt down, for instance, these are wooden ships with tar coating parts of them in order to keep them waterproof, so they're very flammable. That fire was the thing they feared more than anything. He said if the ship had caught fire and burnt down to the, just burnt down to the water line, then we would be seeing wood that had fire char on it. But we don't. So, therefore, the description that the remote viewers gave of the ship went in behind this limestone ridge and to get out of the storm, which, in fact, on the Seaview, the ship, my research vessel, we did the same thing. I mean, it's what all ships, unless you're a huge, I don't know, an aircraft carrier or something, you pull in, you get on the lee side of something that'll break the sea and break the wind up a little bit, and because you're safer. So apparently that's what the remote viewers said had happened, and it was Throckmorton's judgment that, in fact, that was exactly what they had done because of the way of the disposition of the remains of the ship.
And so this evaluation of the accuracy item by item, it's not something you did. It's something done by independent judges.
Oh, yes, this is very important. I don't do the accuracy assessment. I get people who are independent experts. And it's not one person either. That's another thing. There is no such thing as omniscientist. The assumption is that that if you are a specialist in one area of archaeology, you're a specialist in all areas. But I learned very quickly many years ago that's not true any more than if you're a biologist, you're a specialist in all areas of biology. So what you have to do is put teams of people together who will do these assessments. So you get some people that specialize in ship forms. You get other people that specialize in assessment of pottery or objects like that. This turned out to be, in this case, part of what identified this ship was that it had something called Muntz metal on it. I'd never even heard of Muntz metal. But Muntz metal was something used in the 19th century it was a kind of amalgam of metals that didn't rust. That was the important part. That they used in ship construction, and that, just finding that, I mean, Peter was able to date this ship on the basis of a brick from the galley, a nail, and the Muntz metal. Because the shape of the nail, now this is something you and I wouldn't even know, but different kinds of nails, different shapes of nails were used at different periods of history. And different kinds of bricks were used in the galleys where they had a fire going to cook the food. So they would lay down brick in order to keep it from getting to the wood. Well, the kind of brick that was made were made in different kinds of brick manufacturing places, and the nature of the brick and the shape of the nail, and then discovering a piece of Muntz metal that was used for the rigging of the sailing ship. On that basis, he was able to say this ship could not date prior to a certain date, early 19th century. It had to come at a slightly later date in the 19th century, because that was when they began to use this nail shape and they began to use Muntz metal. And so that's the level of detail, and it takes different kinds of experts to be able to make those assessments.
Well, you did an analysis of the probability that you were able to find that Brig Leander, which I thought was fascinating.
If you figure, well, let me actually read it because it's again, within consensus zone C, 65,849 sites of the same size as the ship could be placed, thus yielding a grid of 65,849 cells. If the probability of selecting this particular cell in the grid by chance exceeds p equals 0.05, then remote viewing can be considered the determinative factor. The probability of finding this one 5,000 square foot area out of the square miles would be p equals 0.00009.
Pretty impressive.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's reasonable to say that you couldn't find it. Plus, of course, you also have to get then you get into all these little detailed objects that they describe. So it's not just the location part, but also the reconstruction. And then in addition to that, you can do, of course, the correct, partially correct, incorrect, can't be evaluated. In this case, 4% of the information was considered incorrect. 83% was considered correct. So in addition to that, but then you can get down to how accurate each viewer was by concepts. And so in that way, that taught me how to put together teams of viewers. So if I was going to be doing a view of you as a human being, I'd be sure to put a couple of doctors into the remote viewing team, because they would give me insights about you that a mechanic or a engineer or a physicist just wouldn't give you. And so by looking at these individual accuracy levels, not just on a single project, but over many projects, then that's why we were so successful, is because we had this minute level of detail of analysis. I was able to put together teams of remote viewers. They're not casually assembled. It's not just the first, 7 people that come through the door, but they're very carefully assembled based on their prior performance in certain concept areas.
Well, I would think, or one might think, that after you presented this research and several other comparable projects, that the whole field of archaeology would be pounding on the doors of every remote viewer they could find to begin to widely apply remote viewing methodologies in archaeology. But I gather that hasn't happened yet, even after decades of this research being publicly known.
Yes, that is the sad truth. It doesn't fit the paradigm. And people are very chary of becoming involved with anything that isn't in the paradigm. Dan Cahan at Yale did a series of studies showing that for scientists, the most important thing is not accuracy, but group peer acceptance. That it's much more important that your peer group accept you and value you. That's the most important value. And that people, what he calls risk, that people are very risk adverse. They don't want to say things or to talk about things. I mean, you can look, for instance, at Barbara McClintock's, who won the Nobel Prize. Her early work on genetics was, nobody paid any attention to it. I mean, for years, decades. Because it didn't make any sense. It didn't fit into the paradigm. You can look at, for instance, in archaeology, the no humans before Clovis. The Clovis was a particular site where they found these particular kinds of spear points and knives. And it was thought that there were no humans before Clovis. We now know that isn't true. But for decades, if you talked about humans before Clovis, whether you were just a crank or a nut. So it's difficult for people in science to become adventurous in a certain way. One of the reasons that I always worked with first-tier people, my Eastern Harbor work, the side-scan sonar parallel project was done by Harold Edgerton, who invented side-scan sonar and was the chairman of radiophysics at MIT. The nautical archaeology work that was done in the Brig Leander project was done by Peter Throckmorton, one of the fathers of nautical archaeology. So I always went to first-tier people. And the interesting thing is if you talk to parapsychologists in general, they'll tell you about being shunned by people at their university and how it threatens their tenure and that sort of thing. But I wasn't concerned about that. And I only went to first-tier people. And the reason I did that was I did a lot of research along the way about the relationship between creativity, spiritual epiphanies, and things like remote viewing, non-local task performance. And what I discovered is it was a very similar process resulting in a very similar personal experience, and that people who are the first tier breakthrough leaders who have the insights that change the course of science, when you talk to them about how it happened, they tell you, oh, I had it in a dream, or I just had this vision of this thing. I mean, I could give you countless examples of this. Poincaré saying he has a vision as he goes across the street about his mathematical work, or Nikola Tesla seeing the electric motor as he's walking across Central Park, or Einstein getting the theory of relativity while he's whiling away an afternoon in a canoe. First-tier people have these kinds of breakthrough experiences that are just like remote viewers. And so I always went to first-tier people, not second or third-tier people, because I knew they would be receptive to what I was trying to talk about, and I never got turned down by anybody. I look back on it now. I imagine Harold Edgerton, one of the most famous scientists in the United States. I did not know him from Adam's house cat. I sent him a telex from Egypt saying, I'm doing this thing in the Eastern Harbor and I'm doing remote viewing. And I sent him about a 4-sentence explanation of remote viewing because I knew he wouldn't know anything about it. Would you please come over and do a parallel track using a side scan sonar? And he sent me back a telex the next day saying, if you'll buy me a first class ticket and if you can do it between these dates and these dates, I'm your man.
So you were able to also raise the money to pay for these people.
Oh, yes. Yes. These are not, I think part of the reason that people don't take on these projects very much is that, first of all, they're very complicated. Second of all, they are by definition interdisciplinary. They require whole teams of people. And third, they're very expensive. I mean, they cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, $1 million. So you have to be able to raise the kind of money to be able to do that. And it's not easy to do.
I can appreciate that it's not easy to do, but it does strike me that as a business strategy, you're much better off raising sufficient funds to bring in the best people than to try to do anything like this on a low budget.
Absolutely correct. That's why there were lots of times I was approached by, people who would ask me to do a project. I mean, I've been approached by a number of archaeologists, but, they always say, but I don't have any money. I can't really pay you anything. I mean, these kinds of projects, a typical project, Seaview, for instance, the Seaview project took, depending on how you really calculate it, between 3 and 4 years. So, I mean, you just can't do it for free unless you're independently wealthy, which I was not. So there's no way to do it. You have, there were 25 divers, there were 35 people on the Seaview, and then there were 5 more people in the archives. Then there were 10 more people doing the analysis, so 35, 10, and 10, 45, 55. There were 55 people who were involved in this project. So you got to pay all these guys.
Yeah.
You can't ask them to work for free. I mean, as a matter of principle, I don't do that. You have to, first of all, be able to get them on board. You have to know who they are. So it takes a lot of research to find out who are the right people to ask. I didn't know Peter Throckmorton. Turned out we were related, but I didn't know that. I never met him. I contacted him because he was a specialist in Bahamian archaeology and because he was one of the founders of American nautical archaeology. So I just wrote him and said, I'm doing this project and this is what I plan to do. And I need to tell you that may be a little controversial because I'm using remote viewing and blah, blah, blah. And are you interested? And so I think part of the reason that stops more people from doing it is because it is complicated. It does require so many people from so many different institutions, and because it's very expensive.
Mm-hmm. Well, Stephan Schwartz, I want to say your name properly. Once again, this has been a very informative and enlightening discussion. I have to say that in my mind, it raises many questions. So I hope that we can do several more interviews because I really have different areas I want to probe with you more deeply. But this has been very valuable for me, and I'm sure there will be people watching it long after both you and I are gone, and I hope they pick up the torch and carry it.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I agree with you. And I think these series of interviews that you're doing are going to have enormous historical importance. You have interviewed most of what was visionary scientists of consciousness research doing this series of interviews, and I have a whole other life as a historian, and I know that historians and philosophers of science 50 years from now are going to look back on this and want to know, who these people were and what they thought. I mean, wouldn't you like to know why Newton thought gravity and alchemy had some kind of very meaningful connection for him? I certainly would. And you can't get it because it was never recorded, so there's no way to find out.
Be a good project for remote viewers.
Yeah, you're recording the kind of stuff that people like me 50 years from now who want to know, well, why did they do that? And how did they do that? We'll be able to do it because that isn't what appears in scientific papers. You don't write this kind of stuff in the papers themselves. You just deal with facts.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's why I'm hoping you'll be willing to let me probe a little more deeply into the depths of your own mind, because what you have accomplished in the field of parapsychology, to me, is head and shoulders above anybody working in the applied area. And I think it'll be very important for people to understand, what thoughts were going through your mind.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much. Always enjoy it.
Thank you, Stephan.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP. Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine, or order a beautiful printed copy. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.